No one noticed when it started. There was no obvious moment, no betrayal, no explosion. Just a quiet shift she couldn't explain. At first, it felt like distance, then like effort, then like loneliness, wearing the mask of commitment. She told herself it was normal. Relationships weren't supposed to feel intense forever. Comfort replaced excitement. Routine replaced passion. That's what people said. So she stayed. He wasn't cruel. That was the hardest part. He didn't insult her. He didn't disappear. He didn't cheat. He was just unavailable in ways that were easy to excuse and impossible to fix. He listened, but never deeply. He showed up, but never fully. He cared, but never consistently. And inconsistency is the most confusing form of neglect. She became careful with her emotions, not because she didn't feel, but because she felt too much. She learned which thoughts were too heavy, which needs were too much, which questions led to silence. So she softened them, shortened them, swallowed them. She became fluent in self-editing. He noticed she was quieter. He assumed that meant peace. People often confuse silence with contentment. They don't realize silence is usually the last stage before leaving. She remembered the early days, how he used to ask questions and wait for answers, how her voice felt welcomed, how her presence felt chosen. She wondered when love had turned into something she had to earn again. She tried once. She explained, gently, that she felt alone even when they were together. He didn't get defensive. He didn't dismiss her. He just said, "I didn't know you felt that way." And then, nothing changed. That was when the exhaustion began. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet one. The kind that builds when you keep hoping small conversations will create big changes. They don't. She stopped bringing things up, not because they stopped mattering, but because repeating yourself feels like begging. And she never wanted to be someone who begged for presence. From the outside, everything looked fine. They still laughed, still made plans, still shared space, but emotional connection had turned into something one-sided. She gave, he received, and neither of them named it. She started losing herself in small ways. She stopped suggesting things she enjoyed, stopped expressing disappointment, stopped expecting follow-through. She adapted. Love should never require adaptation to neglect. Sometimes she wondered if she was asking for too much. Then she remembered what she was asking for: to be heard, to be considered, to be emotionally met. That wasn't too much. It was the bare minimum. The realization didn't come suddenly. It arrived slowly, in moments where she felt more alone with him than without him. That's when she understood something painful. Loneliness inside a relationship is far heavier than loneliness alone. He didn't notice her pulling away. Not at first. She was still there, still kind, still accommodating. But something essential had already left. Her hope. She stopped imagining a future with him. Not consciously, instinctively. The future requires trust in change. She no longer had that. He noticed something was different only when she stopped adjusting, when she stopped waiting, when she stopped rearranging herself. To him, it felt sudden. To her, it felt overdue. The night she decided to leave wasn't dramatic. No argument, no tears, just clarity. She realized staying would require her to keep abandoning herself, and leaving would hurt, but it wouldn't hollow her out. She didn't explain everything when she left, not because she didn't have reasons, but because she had already explained them before, multiple times, in multiple ways. He just hadn't listened when it mattered. He was shocked, not because she left, but because he thought she never would. He mistook her loyalty for permanence. He replayed the relationship in his head, looked for signs, missed conversations. Moments he thought were insignificant, only now did they feel heavy. He reached out, not desperately, carefully, Words he thought would sound mature. Reflective. Aware. He said he understood now, that he was ready. She read the message calmly. No adrenaline. No urge to reply. And that silence told her everything. She didn't feel proud. She felt free. Freedom doesn't always feel loud. Sometimes it feels like peace where anxiety used to live. He struggled more than he expected. Not because she was gone, but because no one was quietly holding space for him anymore. No one waited. No one adapted. No one stayed emotionally available without reassurance, and he didn't know how to exist without that comfort. She rebuilt herself slowly, without announcements, without explanations. She learned to listen to discomfort early, to trust herself sooner, to leave before resentment replaced love. She understood something that changed her forever. Loyalty without reciprocity isn't love, it's self-betrayal. She stopped romanticizing endurance. Love isn't proven by how much you tolerate. It's proven by how much you're willing to show up, consistently. He eventually understood the truth. Not all losses come from mistakes. Some come from neglect that feels harmless until it isn't. They never reunited. Not because of anger, not because of pride, but because the version of her that would stay no longer existed. And that is the quiet truth most people miss. Sometimes, relationships don't end because someone stops loving. They end because someone finally starts loving themselves. If this story feels slow, it's because real emotional endings are. They don't shatter, they fade. And by the time someone notices the silence, the story has already ended. She thought freedom would feel lighter than this. Not heavier, just quieter. There were moments when she missed the version of herself that believed things could improve just by loving harder. That version had hope. Hope can feel comforting, even when it's misplaced. Letting go of hope felt like standing without armor. But she reminded herself why she left. Not because she stopped caring, but because caring had cost her too much. She began noticing patterns she had ignored before. How she used to rehearse conversations in her head before speaking. How she measured her words to avoid discomfort. How she anticipated disappointment and prepared herself for it. She hadn't been anxious by nature. She had been adapting. And adaptation, over time, becomes identity. Unlearning, that took patience. She practiced saying what she felt the first time. Not the softened version, not the edited one. And when people responded with respect instead of withdrawal, something inside her rewired. She wasn't too much. She had just been in a place that required her to be less. He, meanwhile, struggled with the absence of emotional gravity. Nothing anchored him anymore. He noticed how empty conversations felt when no one asked deeper questions, how shallow connections dissolved quickly. How exhausting it was to start over without knowing how to sustain intimacy. For the first time, he understood something he never had before. She hadn't been difficult to love. She had been doing most of the loving. He remembered moments he once dismissed, the pauses before she spoke, the way her voice softened when she was disappointed, the nights she stayed quiet instead of asking for more. He thought silence meant acceptance. He didn't realize silence was her last form of self-control. She stopped checking if he watched her stories, stopped wondering if he missed her, stopped assigning meaning to absence. Indifference isn't coldness. It's closure without confrontation. She began trusting her intuition again, leaving situations that felt confusing, choosing clarity over chemistry, choosing safety over intensity. She learned that anxiety isn't passion, it's your body sensing inconsistency. There were moments when she felt lonely, but loneliness felt different now. It didn't feel like rejection. It felt like space, space to breathe, space to choose. He eventually tried to articulate his regret, not to her, to himself. He realized he had confused being needed with being loved. She had needed him emotionally, and he liked that. But love would have required effort without demand, consistency without reminders. And he hadn't been willing to give that. She stopped seeing the relationship as unfinished. There were no missing conversations, no unanswered questions. Everything that mattered had already been said, just not heard. She understood something that brought unexpected peace. Closure doesn't come from explanations. It comes from alignment. And she was finally aligned with herself. He learned something too. Too late, but honestly, you don't lose people when they walk away. You lose them when you make them feel alone while they're still there. She didn't become bitter. She became precise about her boundaries, about her standards, about what she would never again negotiate. She stopped romanticizing patience. Patience without change is just prolonged pain. And if there is one truth that echoes through her story, it is this: love should not require you to disappear to keep it. The world didn't notice her transformation. There were no announcements, no dramatic glow-up, just a woman who stopped shrinking. And somewhere, quietly, a man learned that comfort is not connection. But by the time he understood the difference, she had already chosen peace. With time, she noticed something subtle changing inside her. She no longer rushed emotional intimacy, no longer filled silence just to avoid discomfort, no longer mistook attention for intention. She let people reveal themselves, slowly, and for the first time, she trusted what she saw. There were moments when she recognized old patterns trying to return. The urge to explain herself too much, the instinct to compromise before being asked, the reflex to stay quiet to keep peace. But now she paused, and pausing changed the outcome. She realized that love doesn't require constant self-monitoring. It doesn't make you question your tone, your timing, your worth. Love feels steady, and steadiness had been missing for a long time. He, meanwhile, noticed how his relationships kept ending the same way. Different faces, same distance. People would try briefly and then leave. Not angrily, just decisively. And slowly a pattern emerged that he could no longer ignore. He began understanding something uncomfortable. She hadn't been exceptional because she stayed. She had been exceptional because she endured. And endurance is not something people offer forever. He thought back to how often she had chosen understanding over resentment. How often she had lowered expectations instead of raising concerns. How often she had protected him from consequences. He had called that love. Now he recognized it as emotional labor. She stopped chasing closure. Closure had arrived quietly. The day she stopped imagining conversations that would never happen. When your nervous system relaxes, that's when you know it's over. She learned to recognize safety not by intensity, but by consistency. People who showed up the same way on good days and bad ones. People who didn't require translation. People who didn't disappear when things became real. He noticed how empty apologies feel without changed behavior. He had said the words before, but words are easy when silence has no consequences. She no longer felt the need to be understood by everyone, only by those who were willing to listen. And that changed who stayed in her life. She stopped believing that love meant sacrifice. Love meant presence, reciprocity, effort without reminders. Anything less was familiarity, not intimacy. He finally understood the quiet cruelty of neglect. Not intentional, not malicious, just persistent. And persistence is what makes it damaging. There was a day when she realized she hadn't thought about him in weeks, not intentionally, naturally. And that realization surprised her more than it hurt. She didn't feel victorious. She felt settled into herself. He learned that being missed is not the same as being valued. People miss what was convenient. They value what they invest in. She stopped shrinking herself to fit spaces that never expanded for her. She chose rooms that made space back. And if this story feels slow, it's because real healing it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rush. It replaces noise with clarity. Broken truth, you don't heal by being chosen. You heal by choosing yourself consistently. By the time he was ready to meet her where she had once been, she was no longer standing there. Not because she moved on too fast, but because she waited long enough. And that is how some stories end. Not with forgiveness, not with reunion, but with growth happening in different directions.